Thanks for joining me on episode 498 of the Inspired Stewardship Podcast.
Hey there, I'm Cassidy Cash, the host of That Shakespeare Life. If you'd like to impact the world one day like Shakespeare, one way to do that is listening to this. It's Inspired Stewardship Podcast with my friend Scott Mater.
It burns energy, it burns emotion, it traps you like quicksand, but it doesn't actually do anything. This begins to lead to stress, begins to lead to the feeling that you're trapped, that you're hopeless. It creates a victim mindset by definition. Whining gets you stuck.
Welcome and thank you for joining us on the Inspired Stewardship Podcast. If you truly desire to become the person who God wants you to be, then you must learn to use your time, your talent, and your treasures for your true calling. In the Inspired Stewardship Podcast, you will learn to invest in yourself, invest in others, and develop your influence so that you can impact the world.
In today's episode about investing in yourself by stewarding your time, I talk with you about the difference between whining and venting, why whining is a huge waste of time, and why whining leads to worry and stress, not success.
As we talk about stewarding your time, wouldn't it be great if you could support this podcast and do it without just taking too long? Turns out you can't. All you have to do is use inspiredstewardship.com/Amazon when you're ready to make a purchase via Amazon, and a small commission will come back to support the show just that quick. If you enjoy the show when you are ready to buy from Amazon, just use inspiredstewardship.com/Amazon.
So a few years ago, I was part of the leadership team in a corporation, and I had a dozen or so people that reported directly to me, and then each of those were directors that had a dozen or so people reporting to them. And within the company, I was in a position where oftentimes people would come in with problems. And one of the things that I discovered after a few years is there was a real difference between people that came in and were whining and people that came in and just needed to vent. You know, the truth is, for some of us with our personality and other things, we need to sit down with other people and unload our problems. We need that moment to just talk about it out loud with somebody. Not necessarily to have them provide a solution, not necessarily to have them give input or advice, but just to have them listen. And it's not just a male-female thing. I do think sometimes there's some differences in how the sexes handle things like this. But I've seen both men and women over the years who come in and need that time to just sit down and vent. Sometimes people process information by talking through that information. And so by talking out loud with someone else, they process the emotion, they process the data, they process the information, and oftentimes at the end of it, they say, "Thank you so much for listening. I've got the answer," and they walk out of the room, even though you've said almost nothing the entire conversation. But then there's also folks that come in and do something different. Yeah, the action seems to be the same. I mean, they do start talking about the problem, but very quickly, it becomes clear that they're not actually venting. They're not venting. Instead, they're whining. And so I actually used to tell folks, you're allowed to vent, you're not allowed to whine. And then I had to define it for them. So here's my definition, and maybe you have one as well. And if you do, I'd love for you to share it with me, because I've heard a lot of different definitions of the difference between whining and venting, and I'm always curious about how different people see it. But for me, the cue, the information that helped me see it was venting was when you sat down and you talked about the problem. You talked about the emotion. You talked about what was going on one time. And then you either moved on or began to work and brainstorm and look for a solution. You either asked for advice, you proposed a solution yourself, you went and tried something, or if it was something that was completely out of your control, you left it to the side. You put it down and walked away from it, metaphorically speaking. Whining, on the other hand, was repeating the problem. You were going back over and over again. You began to dwell on the emotion. You began to circle back and talk about it again after you'd finished describing it once. When others tried to move you forward into beginning to think about a solution, you refused to go there and circle back to the beginning and begin talking through the problem again. You begin to make everything about the problem instead of being able to move past it and look forward. Whining begins that circular spiral that often traps us. And I've seen more whining about things that you have no control over, but I've also seen people whine about things that they have complete total control over because they get stuck in that cycle. And see, that's the problem. Whining is a huge waste of your time. Whining is like sitting in a rocking chair, rocking back and forth, hoping that you'll be able to cross the room. Yeah, you might be able to get there eventually, but it's actually going to be really slow, not very efficient, and make a lot of marks on the floor. It's not the way to do it. Whining just wastes time and wastes emotional energy and traps you in a cycle. You remember we've talked before about the 3 Ps, permanent, pervasive, and personal. Whining tends to lead you down the path of making these things, whatever your problem is, into one of those 3 Ps or perhaps all 3. And it just wastes time and emotional energy. Whining leads to worry. And remember, worry, we've talked about before, worry is the least efficient thing on the planet because at the end of the day, worry does nothing. It burns energy. It burns emotion. It traps you like quicksand, but it doesn't actually do anything. This begins to lead to stress, begins to lead to the feeling that you're trapped, that you're hopeless. It creates a victim mindset by definition. Whining gets you stuck. Venting sometimes can help get you unstuck. Whining leads to these bad things, not to success. And again, I want to be clear because a lot of times people hear this and they say, oh, so you're saying I should never talk about my problems. That's not what I'm saying. But you should never whine about your problems. Instead, it's fine to seek advice. It's fine to seek counsel. It's fine to work with a coach or a counselor or a pastor or a friend. It's even okay to vent and just unload things occasionally. Now, I do suggest if you're venting to someone and you don't want their input, you don't want their advice, you don't want a solution proposed, that you let them know up front that you just want them to listen. And then listen to yourself too and think about what you're saying and make sure you don't begin to cycle back and repeat the exact same things that you said before, because then you're no longer venting and you're whining. And again, that's the trap. So be careful and understand the difference between venting and whining. And if you find yourself whining, just stop your whining. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much for listening to the Inspired Stewardship Podcast. As a subscriber and listener, we challenge you to not just sit back and passively listen, but act on what you've heard and find a way to live your calling. If you like this episode on the stewardship of time, be sure to sign up for our Stewardship of Time Tips series by going to inspiredstewardship.com/time or texting 44222 time tips. And that'll get you our best tips on stewarding your time. Until next time, invest your time, your talent, and your treasures. Develop your influence and impact the world.